back to the Integrate Intelligently podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Brickler, again, accompanied by my brother, CEO and founder, Scott Brickler. This is episode 24. How long does it take to integrate? So today we'll talk a little bit about, again, what our specialty is, integration, and talk a little bit about how long does it take, common questions like how long is it going to take, and all of those questions around there. So Scott, getting close to Christmas here, probably getting ready to take some time off. Do you usually take time off during this year, or is it pretty much full steam ahead?
I think we call it separation season. That's like the way I like to look at it, is that when everybody else is pumping the brakes, I like to put on the gas. So I like to work more during this time, a little bit more, but still take some time to spend time with family and things like that. So I think I like keeping the momentum. So I kind of like to work a little, even if I like to work every day, but just a little bit. Sometimes some days I don't work. I work a little bit less. I work less, or just work a little bit in the morning, things like that, in order to keep that momentum going. But definitely separation season right now.
Separation season, yeah.
Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, I mean, let's see. Next week, I guess, will be Christmas week, right? And then the week after, I know that many manufacturing companies, our customers, a lot of times will shut down between Christmas and New Year's. That's not an uncommon thing. I think that's what you used to have when you were manufacturing, right? The companies typically shut down that week after Christmas.
Some do. Yeah, I know my wife, the whole company has that kind of week between Christmas and New Year's off, but it's pretty common to have that happen. So that's why I like to do kind of like more strategic things and more planning and things like that when things are quiet, which is quite nice.
Yeah, it is. Like typically the busy days don't allow you to kind of focus on what you would normally want. But then, as it gets quieter, the last 2 weeks of the year gives you some of that quiet time to focus on, go deep dive on some of the initiatives and ideas and strategies for the coming year. So today, Scott, we're talking a little bit about, length of integration. How long does it take to integrate? And in terms of, I think CAD integration, it's not just CAD integration. We use the word CAD integration and the name CADTALK as a kind of catch-all phrase, right? I think some people take it very literally. That's just CAD with ERP. But when we talk about CAD, what we really mean is kind of engineering softwares, which include all the other acronyms we talked about before, right? The alphabet soups, CAD and PDM and PLM systems, all with ERP. And also some CAD with PLM as well. So any type of integration that involves master data and bills of material, that's what really we focus on. That's our expertise here. And so, Scott, I kind of wanted to paint a picture about what does kind of where did integration, like what did it look like before there was such a thing like CADTALK or sort of pre-built integrations, and then, kind of what it looks like now, and then, what does a time frame look like? So Scott, since you built, the idea of CADTALK was to have a kind of a SaaS or a pre-built integrations that allowed us to just go to market more quickly and get up and running. Can you give us a little history about what did integrations look like before a product like CADTALK or a specialized product like that?
In the old day, probably previously, a lot of integrations were probably more more custom, right? So there was just custom code to be written to do those things. And then, APIs were as prevalent, things like that. But I think when software first kind of came about, everybody was trying to create their own thing to solve a certain problem. And then what happened was that customers ended up having to buy a bunch of different systems that did best of breed. I think we talked about this in another previous podcast. And then they find themselves running 5 to 10, 20 different systems. And they're starting to say, well, the same data exists in all these different systems. Could they talk to each other, right? And then could we integrate them? And then people were like, well, if I integrate, and then you get this whole idea of like an ERP itself is really like essentially a centralization of a bunch of different singular functions from the past. And they basically come up with a big monolithic system that does everything in one system. And that's essentially vertically integrated. They do everything in the one system. And then over time, there's more speciality, there's more niche things that need to be done. And then it proliferates back out to multiple systems. And people are like, well, I kind of want these things to talk to each other again. And, how do I solve that? And there's always this kind of balance between having a big monolithic system or having a bunch of best of breeds and figuring out how to get them to talk. And in the past, getting them to talk was mostly a custom event. Like people would go get consultants who would write the code, and then they would do that work and make it work over time. But we all know the problems with that is that, that could, your co-op you hire to do that, he leaves, he gets another job somewhere else, and nobody understands how the code works, and it's fragile, and there's all of these different kinds of issues around that. And I think what's unique about being in the integration space and trying to productize that is that you're taking all of that headache, and instead of making a product that does a specific thing like accounting or AP and all that kind of thing, you're saying I'm going to build a product that lets you get your other products talking together. Integration is actually the product. And that's where CADTalk kind of comes into it. And there's other players in the space, like Zapier and MuleSoft. There's a lot of integration type products, but I would say what we do is just very, very niche around this kind of bill of material or engineering data avenue. But the idea that integration is the product I'd say is fairly new, probably within the last 10, 15 years. And that's where that comes from.
So the idea being is that as I always explain it to customers when I'm talking, is that we took all the boilerplate, all the normal things that integration has to deal with, right? Which is going to be extracting data. It's going to be logging in, right? That sort of user logging in, handling, that data matching algorithm. How are you going to match this part with this part, that sort of thing. So there are universals across integrations that if you built custom, you'd have to build every time. So every customer would have to build that every single time. What we're trying to do, at least what I explain to customers, is like we eliminate all of that for you. We build a product such that the connection to your ERP or your PLM or your connection to your PDM, it's standard connections, right? It's already pre-built into our add-ins. We can already talk to those systems, and they have that pre-built ability to do the common use cases that you would need. So from an ERP perspective, right, integration ERP, we're creating items, right, item master data, creating bills of material, and then bill of material information, and then other sort of ancillary data around that, right, could be manufacturers or suppliers or routings or other data, sort of tangential data, but that all of that connections are already pre-built. So we're offering all of that is kind of pre-done, and then you can use what you want on demand, right? Without needing to build it from scratch.
Well, you're also think about software is one of the things that makes software really work is that you solve a problem once and then it scales infinitely, right? Or scales pretty fast. It scales when you write a piece of custom software, you don't know what you don't know, right? So all of the knowledge is baked into that piece of code, right? So if I take the knowledge about how to solve this problem and I do it once, then I only have so much that you don't know what you don't know. And you're paying an ignorance tax on everything you don't know. That didn't work under this situation. That didn't work under this situation. But if you buy a software that's being used, that's then being scaled across a large number of organizations, you're getting that community of knowledge into that software that you're getting with the low license cost. You're paying a license cost to basically not have to repeat the same problem somebody else solved. And you're getting best practices bundled with that too, get all the experience of that. So it's not always just the bits and the code that you're buying. It's actually all of that. It's all the knowledge baked into it and all the best practices that we figured out and all of the issues people have gone through before them are also being presented to them in that off-the-shelf solution. That way they're not having to recreate that, because if you write it from scratch, if it's your first time doing it, you don't really know what you don't know. And there is a huge ignorance tax by doing it that way.
Yeah, so we've taken that knowledge, right, and then essentially built the platform, and so that you don't have to figure that out ever again, right? We've taken that away permanently, and so or any of these integration platforms, of course, all different qualities of that in terms of, we're removing the logging in functionality. We're removing the extraction functionality, the custom properties extraction, the connecting to each target system. We're removing all of that. You don't have to do with any of that. You can really just get to the thing that you need most, which is specific to your business, right? That's what you care about. Everything else is already pre-done for you.
It's all pre-done, but there's enough entry points with enough flexibility to personalize it. So because not everybody has exactly the same way of doing things, but you have to have an entry point. You start with a kind of basic algorithm of how things work based on best practices. And then you provide enough entry points or shims where you can go in and say, yes, I do it like this. This is the best practice, but the way that I do it is like this. So you got to balance enough flexibility with enough best practices to create a product that provides a lot of value.
That's exactly right. So we try to fulfill the most common use cases, which there are many, right? There are many common use cases, but then of course, and you want to enable those use cases, that wide breadth of use cases, and make it configurable so that customers can do that, can achieve their goals, right? Otherwise, you get locked into a fixed integration that works a certain way. And then either you got to customize that thing heavily, which you're back into the custom software sort of custom software product, or you got to deal with whatever it just does, right? This is what it does. That's what it does, right? It doesn't do any more than that. And that may not fit your needs. And so what I always tell them is like, the way I describe it is like, you're getting all the benefits. And it's my mind with CADTALK, get all the benefits of a custom software that works tailored to what you need, but it's not custom, with all the benefits of a pre-built kind of SaaS platform. You're getting kind of best of both worlds, right? At least that's my mind. That's how I always vision CADTALK. Ultimate flexibility but also the standard integration that you don't have to build yourself, right? So it's not a DIY, but it's also not a rigid use case.
No, not at all. And I think that's that's kind of because you're trying to cover the market, and as well as provide enough flexibility so they can, because everybody has their special sauce. I think if it's like people like, the whole reason you buy software, you buy save cost or provide an advantage, right? Like and then your process as a business, your process of how to solve the problem for the customer and how you make a product or whatever it is that you do, there's a special sauce that you have that makes you competitive, right? There's something you do better. And so when you have a process, a lot of times people try to have like a cookie cutter, like, well, you're a manufacturer and like, this is how you should do ERP. But everybody has a thing that they do, like a process or a product or some kind of feature of their business that's very, very, very custom to them. It's very idiosyncratic. So what you want to do with software is like, you're like, well, I want you to use my tool to be a better version of what you already are, as opposed to trying to change you and to look like everybody else, which I think a lot of software is like, this is the way we do it. This is the industry standard. You do it our way or hit the highway. It's like, no, like we should guide you towards industry standard, but then give you the flexibility to be you, because that's what made you different and that's what makes you competitive. So you want to have that balance of, like, you can push the best practices and get you in place, but we also have room for your special sauce.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely, no, I think that's absolutely right. So we know what the sort of pitfalls or the risks of building an integration from scratch, right? Because of how much effort and cost it is, right? Because you got to do everything, as we talked about. You can't really utilize anything of the past. Maybe someone's written one in the past and you can steal that code and kind of makeshift it, right? Makeshift it for use case, but really it's not it's not built for you, right? So even if you try to use someone else's code and modify it, now you're just trying, you're trying to save money. It's still the challenges there. So what we're trying to do with the platform, I think, is really about making it sustainable, making it achievable and less expensive from an implementation standpoint. I think regardless of any integration, there are pitfalls, there are risks, right? What do you see? What does implementation look like to you, Scott, in terms of when you first started? And then, of course, I've worked on projects and where implementation is now. But I think there are some frameworks we can use or fundamentals we can use when thinking about not just CADTALK, but implementing any software or integrations. What are some fundamentals to think about, about integration? How long should it take? What are the steps?
Absolutely. Well, I think we actually touched a little bit upon this during the ERP episode. We talked about, like, if I'm looking at an ERP, what should I focus on? It's the same thing with integration. Like, you look at it and go, what problem am I really trying to solve? And what's the most important problem? And I think that the same thing happens with ERP, where people, like, they try to solve a problem with scheduling, and then they get into it and they figure, like, oh, they can do this, they can do this, they can do this. And the scope just goes like this, right? All over the place. And then, we call it, there's all these shoulds that come up. You should all over yourself. Like you should all over yourself, because you're like, well, I should be doing AP automation. I should be doing this. I should be doing, like, look at all the stuff this product can do. And then there's like this cognitive dissonance. If I buy a product that does a lot of things and I only use if it does 10 things and I use 2 things and I'm overpaying for it. Well, that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. People do think that way, but so they tend to, when they buy things, they tend to have really big, really big eyes on what they want to do. But at the end of the day, if you pay for a product and it solves that major issue that you first thought about, and you're okay with that value exchange, everything you do beyond that is a bonus.
Yeah.
Right. Everything you do beyond that is a bonus. So I would approach the implementation with that mindset. Let me get the core thing in and working and get that value as quickly as possible. How fast can I get the value? So I see that original benefit that I set. And then I could go back and go, what? I already paid for this thing. What else can it do? And then had this kind of iterative process of going through and saying, well, not only I noticed when we were doing the implementation that this ERP also has this really cool thing with, this, or that CADTALK has this thing where it issues part numbers to my guys or whatever it is. Like it does all these really cool things. I didn't want to because what you don't want to do is which is very, very common, is that people get these big eyes, they expand the scope of the project, and then the whole thing, then they get fatigue and the whole project goes to crap and they lose all the benefit. And that tends to be the biggest risk. Whereas you're better off with this kind of let me get the core thing that I wanted done and then iterate and go on. So you want to have more of this kind of evolutionary type of approach to implementation, as opposed to a big bang implementation where you're trying to just pack as much stuff in as possible. You have to go back to what problems are actually trying to solve the first time, and really limit that scope.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pressure, especially these days in IT projects. You see in ERP conversations all the time about pressure to get the value, right? Time to value is a common metric. How long does it take to get the time to value that get that quick ROI? And of course, there, ERPs and other softwares are in the cloud, and CADTALK included, right, have built up to try to provide that ROI as quickly as possible. But you really have to narrow down what are the KPIs? What are the metrics? What are the things that you're trying to solve? What are the big ROI things? And get those working. Otherwise, as you said, you can get big eyes, like you're going to a buffet and you're going to put all this stuff on there and then you're going to end up choking and you're not going to get the value of what you really need. And that's the worst part of it, because all the time that you're spending on that project trying to implement, yet another thing, this other feature, this other little cool thing. I'm going to automate this, I'm going to automate that. The project goes on longer, you have a higher risk of failure, high risk of not adoption. And all of those are things that don't bring any value whatsoever.
I mean, I think projects are a lot like, in some ways like companies, where it's like most projects do not fail from starvation. They fail from indigestion, trying to do too many things. And that's true of a lot. That's actually true of a lot of things in life, but that's especially true for projects. And it's and I think it's this idea of well, how can people always think they have one bite at the apple or one chance to do this thing. And it's like an event, I'm just going to do this thing. Whereas that is rarely how most things are done. Right. I mean, you don't lose weight in a weekend, right? You have a good diet, and then eventually, and over time, if you're at a deficit, you'll lose weight over time. And then if you maintain that kind of practice, you'll stay thin, right? It's just the same, all of these things are like that. So it's no different with an implementation or anything else. It's almost I always hate using the word implementation, right? It's implementation is part of the life cycle of the work. It's not. It's actually a bigger percentage of the life cycle is implementation than you really believe. Because I think implementation kind of these ideas. When I implement, then there's actually an event that's done, and there's a little bit more of an infinite game. We talk about finite and infinite games. Finite game being a game that ends. Infinite game means the purpose is to keep going, right? Implementation is an infinite game. You're never gonna have it exactly the way you want it. You're constantly refining it. You're constantly making it better.
No, that's exactly right. I myself, worked on 100 projects when I was doing, worked on 100 projects at least. I learned firsthand when a project took on too much, the customer took on too much, that they just didn't get the value from it, right? It just never could get going, right? Just didn't deliver for them the way they wanted it to, because they got all this time and all this effort spent into it. And it's just and it didn't get what they wanted, not because of the software, but because they just tried to do too much. And certain things they had to, sacrifice, or their data wasn't as good, or there was some issues, and, really need to focus on the core. What are the core, like anything else, right? There are core tenets, right? There are core foundational things. Focus on those. Like you said, I know that you and I both, have come to fitness and health at a later point in life, but it's pretty simple, right? It's not complex. You eat, as you were mentioning, you lift some heavy weights, you do some cardio, keep your heart strong, and you eat fewer calories than you need. You try to focus on, whole foods and the things that are put you in a calorie deficit, and away you go, right? You will get better. But it's like anything else. Like when I was learning a language, right? You can't learn a language overnight. I studied 6 languages in my life. My former life as a language nerd and teacher. You couldn't. I didn't learn Latin over 1-2 years. I spent 25 years with that, and it was always just a little bit more, slowly but surely, cranking along. And really got to develop that muscle, right? That's the muscle you got to develop to be the most successful, to get really the biggest bang for your buck. That culture of, I think that's one of our values here. We had it is like the kind of relentless reinvention, right? This idea you just keep coming back and keep iterating.
Well, yeah, and I think it's like it's very. I think everybody thinks that like more is better when you talk about like any of these types of situations. Is you can get to this, you can get everything you want, you just can't get it all today, right? And then so you have to kind of, and then I think what happens is that the complexity goes up exponentially, right? As you add more things that you want to do, the complexity goes up. And humans, we have limitations, right? We can only think in so many levels. We can only think in some levels of complexity, right? So I see this all the time, even internally and things like that, is people get very tunnel vision, right, on certain problems and things like that. And then if you introduce more, it's like golf swings are this way. If you got like 5 things, they coach you on 5 different things, trying to do them all at the same time, your swing would just be horrible, right? But if they told you like, hey, just do this one thing, in their golf swing, it tends to work better, right? Like then you layer, once you have that down, you layer on something else, But if I told you 50 things, you wouldn't know how to do any of them. Same thing happens with implementations, or even like with a diet. If I tell you like just eat less calories than you consume, that was it, and then you did that, you're going to lose weight by physics, right? But I say, no, but you got to hit 200 grams of protein every day. Then you're like, well, now I got 2 rules, right? And then I go, oh, then you want to make sure you hit these kind of micronutrients and this, and now you have all this complexity, and they're going to contradict, and then you're going to overthink it, and then you're going to be like, man, I'm not hungry, but I need to eat a bunch more protein, otherwise I'm going to lose muscle, and you get crazy, and then you actually don't lose weight, which is the thing you were trying to do. So like adding that complexity, people can't. That complexity actually makes the end result worse in a lot of ways, because humans have a hard time managing multiple conflicting priorities and complexity. So it's much easier to like take it as far as you can, and then layer on something new, take it as far as you can, layer on something new, take it up further, as opposed to doing all these things just a little bit and not getting very far,
Yeah, that leads me into kind of like how do we approach our CADTalk implementations? Because I think one of the risks at CADTalk, I think this is that you can do like any software, but because it's so flexible in the sense that you can really take on too much, try to do too much, just like an ERP, right? Because of the level of configurability, the number of use cases we can cover, the kinds of things you can do. You can do too much. I mean, I've learned in the past several years as I've worked with our implementation team, our professional services team, to really develop a process that it works well to customers to get value. We have, a kind of a 5-phased approach. Sometimes I talk a 7-phase approach, depending on how you look at it. I know that I want to talk a little bit about how we do that, right? What does that approach look like in terms of implementing? And I think this approach would be good, even if you were using any kind of other software, not just CADTalk, but even if you're building your own, right? Like these are good kind of foundational things to think about in terms of how to implement a software. So, Scott, did you want me to talk about them, or did you want to kind of review the 5 steps or the 5 phases we do with our implementations?
No, you're probably closer to it than I am anymore these days. So let's go ahead and have it. Have at it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I learned, again, over 100 projects, even before I documented the processes, you would see a kind of rhythm of like how things would go, right? And this didn't all come out in one time. I built this over years, but what we find out, we always start off what I call the initiate phase. And that initiate phase is really just getting the softwares downloaded, installed, connected, right? Your ERP, your CAD or your PLM system, your PDM system, get them connected and talking, getting them communication, right? As we said, with that pre-built integration. So getting them connected doesn't take very long, but that's the first step, right? Get the software connected, downloaded, installed, connected, licensed, ready to go. And then the next phase is that educate phase. And so because CADTalk is a platform, we really want to work with the customers in terms of learning how to use it, the interface, learning, what the process looks like, how do you do the testing, how do you do the configuration. Even if the customers don't do the configuration, or they're using our professional services, we still talk about the education phase. You got to what we call educate. So as you might imagine, we got to initiate, starting off, the educate. We're educating customers about what it can do, what it can do, what we recommend in terms of scope. So now I've developed, in the past, we should use custom scopes for everybody. And now I've honed that down to kind of a 10 or 12, like really common things that everybody typically does, or very common use cases, and that are high value things. And then we educate them on not just how to use the product, but like, these are the 12 things that almost everybody does, right? Everybody does these. Now you might have, it's at 80%, right? 80% of customers always do this. So really do this. And I come up with that sort of fixed scope so that like we can plan out the start and finish to the project so that customers can get that value and not risk taking on too much, right? So really focusing on that core value. That's in that educate phase. And then once we get into next is the collaborate phase. And that collaborate phase is really matching that predefined scope. And I always tell customers, don't worry, this predefined scope that we're going to implement has a lot of value, right? Can do a lot of things. It's not the end, right? Let's not focus on it being, it's just this, right? It can be more than this. We can add on, like you said, but let's just focus on the core, those 10 or 12 things. And during the collaborate phase, we're working with our clients to find out, what are they doing in their designs, right? What does engineering processes, release processes look like? What's their design processes look like? What does the engineering change look like? What does their properties, right? What does that look like? And so really mapping the two sides of the data, whether that's of, what does that, it look like in engineering? What's it look like in manufacturing? Or what's it look like in PDM and CAD? Or what's it look like in PLM? What do those two data structures look like? And how do we get there based upon that kind of fixed scope? And that's in that collaborate phase. And we get down to it, it is somewhat of a data mapping exercise. It's not 100% data mapping, but
I think of it more, it's a transformation exercise, because like
it is a transformation exercise.
I think mapping trivializes it. I really do. It's not that simple.
I agree 100%. I 100% agree. It's not that simple. And I always explain that to customers. That's a good point. I know it's kind of a pet peeve of yours, because people will always kind of boil things down to the simplest thing. Oh, it's just a mapping exercise. I've even had customers tell me that on demonstrations. Oh, it's just a mapping exercise. It's like, well, I mean, yes, if you wanted to trivialize it or turn it into the smallest possible thing, it is a mapping exercise, but it's really more than that. I think you're absolutely right. It is
having a child is a mapping exercise of the woman and man's DNA.
Yeah, exactly. Right. No, agreed. Right. Yeah. So like, that's okay. We get a bit salty, but yeah, no, it's true. I don't disagree. It's a bit hot take. It isn't just a mapping exercise. I think, but it's a transformation. And I think the team even uses the term transformation. We're doing transformations. We're transforming the data from one type into another. And not just data types. We're talking about transforming the way the data looks, how it's formatted, maybe even combining data from other sources using different things. But it is that data transformation but defining that data transformations. So I would say, to your point, there's that collaborate phases defining the data transformations. What is the data transformation going to look like? And sometimes that's going to just be seriously things like, hey, my description is really long in CAD and my PDM or PLM, and it's too large for my ERP or my PLM system, so I need to break it up and put it in different fields, right? Or I have an English description and a French description, or an English description and a Japanese description. I need to put my English description in the English description field and the Japanese description in the Japanese description field. And they're both descriptions, right? But it's not simply a mapping exercise, right? Because you may say, well, sometimes I don't have an English description. I only have a Japanese description, right? There are all these kind of things around there. So there is a transformation that happens. So that happens during our collaborate phase, where the customer and one of our architects really talk about what does that transformation look like. That's that collaborate phase. Now, once they get that defined, they enter what we call the generate phase. And that generate phase is really around rules, right? What are those transformations? What are the actual configuration transformations in CADTALK look like? How do we build in that rules that the customer gave us, right? Well, in this, if A, then B, right? If A and B, then C, or whatever that is, right? Building that in, or doing lookups, right? I have it called each is over here, but that's pieces over there, right? Or I call it each is over here and it's called units over there, whatever that looks like. Doing those transformations, those lookups, those conversions, if you will, that's during that generate phase. That there is just the rule process. And whenever you do the generate, I kind of combine these, but sometimes you can keep them separate phases, but I kind of combine them because they iterate. The generate and the validate, right? You generate these rules based upon the collaborate phase. You collaborate. Okay, what do I want? This is how I want it. I generate that, and then you validate it. And then sometimes you validate, goes, that's not valid, back to the generate, and then back to the validate, and back to the generate, and back to the validate. And then eventually, right, your generate and validate keeps going. This is kind of an iterative back and forth approach. I call that sort of generate and validate phase. I kind of put them together, even though you could consider them kind of two phases, but I keep them together because it's like a circle, right? Generate, validate, going back and forth, back and forth. And you're doing that so that until that collaborate phase, till all the things that you've defined in the preset kind of use cases are done. And that's the value you're trying to get to, right? That's the main, and those are the main things that you're trying to get to so that you get to our last phase called accelerate, which is using the product, right? Really getting it out there in the wild, letting your users use it. And so that's our 5 steps of implementation and what that looks like. But it's around, a fixed scope. And then I remember customers would ask me, well, is that all I can do? It's like, no. Once they get in there, I think, Scott, you've seen this as well when you did projects. When customers get in there, you've heard this even from the team, they go, wow, this thing it's powerful. It can do a lot. And you're like, yes. And then they start going, well, can it do this? And can it do this? You say, yes. And back to this initial value, back to the initial value.
It's psychological too. It's like, we heard this, it's like that's why people separate things out as features and they charge for them separately. And you get in this whole kind of thing. Cause like there actually is a psychological effect of like, once they realize that it does something that they're not using, it then devalues in their mind.
It does. No, that's true.
And it's completely weird. It's like, you were perfectly okay with paying this much money for this thing yesterday. But now that you know that it does twice as much stuff, you feel like you're overpaying for it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's so weird. It's like a weird way I do the same thing with like, even I do it sometimes, I've been evaluating software and I'm like, well, I have this software, I have this one, but that thing that does something that I already have software for. So I don't like that one as much. And I'm like, why? Like, you don't have to use that thing. And if it does, if you're okay with the price and it does the thing you want, then what does it matter if it does the other thing? Because you're like, well, I'm paying for something I don't use, which is a weird kind of like human illogical thing that's very common. And I even see it myself sometimes, but it's like, so you have to be careful about like that happens as well. So people, that's what drives a lot of time. I think also drives implementations to go up is because now they feel like if they don't do all this other stuff, then therefore they're overpaying.
Right. It's like going to the buffet, right? You're going to the buffet. You're like, I got to eat everything at this buffet because I paid, $29.99 or if you're in Vegas, $99.99 or whatever it is.
But you pay $29.99 for a steak and some fries, but then like you put a buffet on it, it's like, man, I didn't get my sundae. It's like, I don't know, and you're like all pissed off, right? Then you didn't get your sundae,
No, totally. Right. You'd go to a regular restaurant, you'd pay $25 for your steak and your fries or your burger or whatever you're going, right? You go to wherever. Then you go to the buffet, you're like, but I paid, you paid 20% more. You're like, I'm going to get my 20%. No, I'm going to get my, and then what ends up happening is you gorge, right? You overgo. I mean, you eat too. I get that sundae. Oh, that brownie looks pretty good. Hey, have you tried those rolls? No, it look pretty good though, right? And then like you can really get indigestion. To your point earlier.
Yeah. The problem was that, like I was hungry, and then you solved it, and you're like, and then now you're stuffed and you feel like crap, right? And then you're like, man, I hate what I eat. It's just like, it doesn't, it just doesn't make any sense. And I gained 10 pounds in this one buffet meal. Right. So, it's just funny. It's like,
psychological thing. It's totally psychological.
Yeah. It's like the humanness of the situation, and you get that a lot. I mean, like the human element can't be discounted. But I think that's one of the ideas that the good purpose of this podcast is like to talk about those things and go, yeah, like, to hopefully educate people is like, go against your initial thinking, with these types of things. And, we see a lot of like human behavior, which is to discount. If you're willing, if you're okay with the value you get for a certain cost, just because the thing can do more doesn't mean you should do more, and then that's actually a very common kind of like fallacy in people's minds, a common like a psychological fallacy that could catch people, and you actually could end up throwing out all of the thing you would have gotten by having that. And you're actually putting at risk by doing more. You actually are putting at risk the thing that you were willing to do. You'd have been ecstatic if you had just that thing, but now that you're paying for it and you can do that thing and something else, and you don't get both, you actually give up you're actually putting at risk getting the original thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a killer point, because you go out to get something and you'd be perfectly happy having that and say that I'm getting my value, instead of looking at it like that you're getting all this other value that you could take a part of at a later date, right? You're still getting all that value. You're saying, if I don't get that value right now, then I don't get it, right? Like, or it's not valuable to me if I can't get all of it, right? It's just like it's all or nothing mentality.
There's some kind of economic theory behind this. It's like active discounting. It's like, you're like, I'm willing to pay $1 for this, and you're like, and then you pay then you're like, you're looking at things and you're like, for $1, I can now get this plus 50% more. And therefore, in your mind, you actively discount the thing. You're like, well, it isn't worth $1. You're like, well, you were willing to pay $1 yesterday, like literally a minute ago. But it's that relative thing, which is how markets work and everything else. And not to get into like game theory or the crazy market theory and all that kind of stuff, but like that's literally the human aspect of it, right? That's how markets are driven. But you have to go back to like what, like, like you can get really existential. You're like, the life that you have today 10 years ago may have been a dream, but now it's not good enough. It's like the hedonistic treadmill thing, right? It's the same type of problem. And but yeah, just something to keep in mind, like not to kind of make it crazy, but like with implementations, the same type of thing happens that causes things and then you actually get into the problem of overdoing it and actually putting the thing that you really wanted at risk. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think it's really important to get to the value and the part that's really important to you, the most important part. I know recently I've been on projects helping the team, and I've run into this, was where the customer's really pushing for more and more and more and more, and the project would go longer and longer and longer. And I would advocate, hey, is this really necessary? Is this really critical to the project? Is this, and they, oh yeah. I'm like, okay. I said, the longer this goes on, the more you try to do. Yeah, we can do all that. But the longer and the more you do, the more at risk you are. We want you to get value and use out of the product right away, as fast as we possibly can. Let's not get sidelined and trying to do it all.
Oh yeah. I think that there's also this idea that like saying that more is better and what's not. I mean, like a lot of times what I've noticed, I mean, this is actually a principle in coding, like it's called test-driven development, things like that, where it's YAGNI is another term. You ain't going to need it. That happens in development. People will overwrite code all the time. They're like, write code and like, well, they might try to do a denial of service attack over here. And like, well, you got to make sure it's going to be fast. And then they do all this stuff. And they've been at building like a crap load of code for all these contingencies. And then it's like, no, I mean, it's going to run a laundromat. I mean, who cares? I mean, so like, it doesn't really, just gets crazy, right? So the idea of like test driven would be only write enough code to pass the test that you care about and no more. And then get a requirement for something else, write another test for the new requirement, and then write enough code to pass that test. And then you guarantee to get around the human behavior of bloat by only allowing you can only write code when you have a test that validates that code has a requirement that your code needs to do. Because it's so natural for humans to add. Subtraction is difficult. Adding is easy. And that's the same thing. And so you have to be literally guard against that in your life all the time. And implementation is a huge part of that. We just keep adding. It gets better every time we add. Actually, right. It doesn't. Because that risk, people discount the risk of it actually failing because you added too much.
Right. Try to do too much. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, that's why we really focus on those 5 phases and provide that initial scope so that customers, we find that it gives the right amount. But, after you finish that, if you feel like and you're using it, you could always come back and add on more, right? You could always come back and say, well, it's not uncommon for customers to come back and say, hey, I have another project I want to do, right? I have some additional automation I want to do. Hey, we changed our process, or we enhanced our process. We really want to leverage CADTalk to automate some of that. You can come back and do more. I've seen that time and time again. In fact, we just had a longtime customer, one of our customers in the Infor space, longtime customer, great customer, spent many a time together at the user conferences, come back and just said, hey, I want to do a project, and just bought some more implementation, right? Some more consultings, because they had another project. They've been using CADTalk for God, it's got to be 5 years, maybe 7 years, and still finding ways
Oh
to
yeah.
to improve it, to enhance it, to get more value out of it.
Well, I mean, people think I think also there's this idea of like maximizing the dollar spent. So like I'm spending money to get implementation or whatever it is. How can I get more for the same amount of money, or same less, or whatever? You're already doing it, or all this kind of thing. And then there's actually a great story about this with a customer from years ago. It was actually doing when I was working at ERP, and we were doing like customization. We were building some stuff, and then we built this whole thing out, and they were running it. And then when it scaled up to more users, the speed started getting the issue. Like there was a performance issue. So, but you didn't see it until you got to like 10, 15, 20 users all using it at the same time. And they were like, and so we're doing it, and then get down, we're like, oh, okay, cool. There's a speed issue here. We can look at optimizing that. And then the customer was like beside themselves, angry. They're like, why didn't you assume and assume that there was going to be speed issues and plan that as part of your development cycle? And why are we having to do this now? And I was like, totally understand. Cool. I mean, it kind of makes sense. I said, but it's a complex problem. I said, so I kind of explained to them, I said, we could have built this thing, and I could have assumed all these different areas would have been slow. And I could spend a lot more time making all of these areas faster along the way with my assumptions of what I think is faster or slow based on my knowledge, which is limited, which is still good, but not completely limited. And I could build them all, which would add, and fast code is complex code. People don't realize that. So, because you're always balancing out different pros and cons. Or I could just build the thing, see where it's slow, and only optimize that. And then all that code I would have written to optimize things that I thought might be slow would be saved. And overall, it would actually cost you less money. And then it was like, and the customer goes back and goes, good plan, thank you. But the belief is that they were somehow paying more because they had to do it again at the end. Just like we don't write papers first time in one draft. You write the paper, and then you cut and you draft and do it again. So it's actually more efficient if you try and write the whole thing at the same time. So it's like the same thing with code. So you write the code, you get feedback. That's why the whole what's it called? Lean startup mentality of MVP, get feedback, refine. Same thing. Build it, get feedback, refine. Build it in a way that you're not painting yourself in a corner. You have to rewrite it if something happens, but don't over optimize. Don't prematurely optimize. Look and build it, get feedback, build it again, build some more.
Right.
It's actually cheaper too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have some key takeaways here, right? And I think we've hit upon these in the past at other, I'm sure if we covered this with David Trout or Kevin Miller or even Steve Mold, common things, right? Which is focus on what the most important things are, stay within those boundaries, and do less is more, and think of it as a journey, not a destination, right? If you can focus on those and then try to listen to the people who've been doing it too, right? Like we've done hundreds and hundreds of projects. We've learned a thing or two over the years about what works and what doesn't work. If we have never failed, we never learned anything, right? We have made mistakes, and I think you would want someone to make mistakes and say, yeah, we made mistakes and we learned and we made changes, and those changes had improvements and valuable for the customer. So my key takeaways are, follow the plan of implementation, get the high value things going, and see it as a journey, not a destination. Get the value, get it going, get, as you said, like lean startup, get feedback, get it going, get feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then that's how you can figure out what really matters. Yeah.
Right. Well, great, Scott. This was another good conversation. I feel like we got similar themes here recently, but it all ties together. I think, how CADTALK was built in terms of flexibility, what we learned on working on projects and what's been successful for customers. And then, the ability to continue to enhance CADTALK over time, especially because it's a configurable product, and then keeping the scope simple and to get the value that you need. All of those have been valuable lessons. So if you want to learn more about our implementation approach or, about the CADTALK software, visit our website at CADTALK.com. So Scott, it looks like, the next 2 weeks is getting close to the Christmas at the end of the year. I don't know how many more times we'll be here together, but looking forward to 2025, big plans. And anything else on your agenda and topics you want to discuss before we sign off?
No, I think I just want to wish everybody happy holidays. I mean, you might be listening to this after the holidays, so happy whatever time of year it is. Hope everybody either has or will or had a great time during the holidays. Spent time with family, and and then kept at it. So looking forward to talking more. Yeah.
Agreed. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, happy New Year. If we don't see you, if we see you again, we'll wish it again. If it's after the new year and you're seeing this, no problem. Welcome to 2025. And we're excited to continue this conversation. So Scott, thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks.